Continuing with chapter 7 on prokaryotes. John's not looking so good at the dinner table. And one assumes his wife at the other end says, "John, I wish you'd stop bringing all these horrible diseases back from the city." Now we're going to talk about specific pattern that diseases sometimes follow in their evolutionary course. And it may not just be prokaryotes, it could be viral diseases too. It probably is not protozoan diseases, but it could be. But it fits. And so we just talked about disease organisms and their needs in general. So this is the evolution of what we call childhood diseases. These are diseases that we connect with kids because before we develop vaccines for them, typically the kids would get them. When I was a kid, everybody got chickenpox pretty much, or got the measles, or got the mumps, or got rubella. And one of the things that we knew about it is that if you didn't pick it up when you were a kid, if you didn't get it and then you got it when you were older, in your mid to late teens or as adults, it was a much nastier course of disease than what kids got. Now these diseases weren't totally benign in kids, is that several thousand kids a year would have died of the measles. But the thing is, not that many adults got them because a lot of them had them as kids. Now we vaccinate for them, and then it protects everybody. We did such a good vaccination campaign on the measles that, I'm trying to think of how long ago, probably 40 years ago, a case appeared in Siena College down in Albany and spread through the college, even amongst people that had their vaccinations. And up until that point, nobody had realized, they didn't have the technology really to check, and you don't do a challenge test where you try to give somebody the measles. Everybody just assumed that just like getting the measles would give you basically a lifelong immunity, the vaccination would do the same thing. And it turns out it doesn't for everybody, that some people's immunity wanes and they need a booster shot for the measles. And but so many people had gotten vaccinated that the people whose immunity had waned, they weren't getting exposed to measles when they were adults until this one outbreak. And now we're very careful about making sure that when people come into college, they're protected by surrounding them with vaccinated individuals, most of whom are still immune. So measles, mumps, you don't want to get those as adults. My sister got the measles when she was I think 16, and didn't get really sick, but as sometimes happens when a disease hits a demographic that it isn't really compatible with, her hair fell out. Is that her head hair didn't fall out, but her eyebrows fell out and her eyelashes fell out. Some of her body hair fell out. And it took years and years and years to grow back. Odd result. So this is going to go by steps. So this is something that's been cooking out there in some sort of animal host. And it's an animal host that one way or another comes in contact with humans. Maybe it is a domestic animal and is in contact with the farmers. Maybe it's a wild animal and is in contact with hunters. Maybe it's a popular thing in these odd markets like they had in Wuhan, where people like to go and buy wild animals to eat them. And so now you've got an exposure to a whole nother demographic group of humans. And in that case, it's actually jumped one of the steps we're going to have up here. But most of the time, organisms that are compatible with the animal are not going to be terribly happy moving to the person. And maybe they're going to make them really sick really fast, and that's going to be the end of it. Maybe they're going to make them sick, but are not going to be capable of jumping on to the next person from that person. We talked about that last time. But so you need a variant that can move into people and then it must be capable of moving to other people from there. Now, I first ran into this pattern brought up in an article that asked a question that had never occurred to me. It's well known that in the age of exploration, as the Europeans spread across the world with their ships, that they would come to new lands and they would bring diseases with them that would decimate the local populations. Just not wipe them completely out, but just wipe huge fractions of the population out. And the article was kind of asking the question, so what came back with them? What diseases of these indigenous populations did they bring back to Europe and wipe out a bunch of Europeans with? And the answer is probably none, possibly syphilis. But syphilis is a very long-term, long-acting disease, so it kind of breaks a lot of the rules here. As we go through this step by step, I'm going to talk about how the current coronavirus breaks a lot of the rules in this pattern, because the real world is messy, and even though there are repeated patterns, there's going to be exceptions all over the map. Welcome to biology. Biology is definitely a science of exceptions. The thing about the indigenous populations that they did not have, that the Europeans did have, Europeans had networks of cities. This very much depends on pockets of large populations fairly close to other pockets of large populations. So this pattern originates in places like Europe and in places like Asia, in China. There's some indication that when the Mayan civilization was at its biggest, most city networky, that they were developing their own version. That they actually may have been in the midst of a new one decimating the population when the Spaniards came. We generally blame that wave of disease on the Spaniards, but some people have found some indications that maybe they were already in the throes of a major plague, essentially, at that time. But keep in mind, plagues have often come to Europe from Asia, another place with a lot of interconnected cities. So this is new to people. It is not terribly compatible with people. It tends to mess with their chemistry and mess with all the other stuff we talked about in the last section. And a lot of people are not going to survive it. Or they're going to be totally incapacitated, which may very well contribute to them dying, especially in medieval times where you might, if you couldn't go out and do stuff, then you might just lie in your bunk and starve to death. So the first wave of this disease is deadly to a pretty good fraction of the population. Now, who doesn't it kill? There will be people in the population who, for one reason or another, are resistant. They're not immune, they don't have antibodies yet, but their chemistry is in some way not going to react as nastily to the invader as other people's chemistry. Maybe they maybe they mount a better early defense system. Sometimes it's luck of the draw. There's another reason why coronavirus is a little odd. I talked about this last time, that some people are resistant because they've recently had a viral infection, and those defenses are still up and active when the coronavirus comes in, and it kind of keeps the coronavirus from getting out of control. Now, that's a different type of resistance. In order for this resistance to fit into the pattern, it needs to be something genetic. Now, sometimes you get people that survive just because of other factors. An ironic example of that is that when the plague went through Venice, Italy, and it wiped out a huge fraction of the population, one of the subpopulations that came through pretty unscathed were the local Jews. Well, it turns out that the plague was being spread by fleas, and the Jews had, their culture required a much cleaner home environment than the other people in the city. So they avoided exposure. They weren't really resistant, but their cultural patterns kept them from being infected. And after a couple of waves of this, the locals went, the Jews are not getting sick. They must be making this happen. And they killed a bunch of the Jews off. So I said there was an ironic component to this. They survived the plague, but they did not survive the repercussions of surviving the plague. So evolution, right? Changing conditions, selecting the survivors pass on whatever aspects of their genetics makes them survivors. This is why in this case you need the resistance to be inheritable. Now, the local population of people are pretty slow generationally turnover, but they will pass a lot of whatever makes them resistant onto their kids, eventually, when they have kids. Now, who's going to be most successful in spreading the disease through the city? Those variants of the organisms that have the least nasty effects on the host. The ones that can keep their host up and moving around and exposing their offspring to other hosts. So, like we talked about last time, you get a drop in virulence. So the local population is being pushed toward a more resistant form of human, and the local disease organism population is being driven toward not being quite as nasty to the people. The thing is, though, these first waves are probably going to get carried, because you need a network of cities. The first waves are probably going to get carried out by people in wagons or other sorts of things. If there's any kind of incubation period, you may get a spread of this to other nearby cities before this drop of virulence becomes really, really significant. So you could develop a really nasty, widespread plague, even though the disease may gradually become less virulent. So it rides to other cities and starts the same pattern. Maybe it's not as nasty in the other city, but there's going to be a whole bunch of potential hosts who really can't deal with it still. Even a less virulent form, they're not going to do so well. They're going to get sick and die, maybe at lower levels. Remember I talked about the Ebola mortality rate dropping from 95% in the initial small villages to 50% once they've been cooking in the city for a while. That's still 50% mortality. It's still doing a pretty nasty job to the local population. And so you got a big network of cities. It's going from here to here to here to here. Now the initial city, the people that have survived, at this point, they are immune, right? They've developed antibodies. They cannot get this disease again. So the disease can't really swing back into the first city until there's a potential population of hosts there, which is going to take a few years because you got to generate a new population of hosts, kids. So this swings back in when there's a decent population of children. Now, children are chemically different from adults in a number of ways, and in the ways that they respond to diseases. So the way that it's sorted through resistant everybody, now it's really just sorting through resistant children. And it's becoming less virulent in children. And then it's those children are then immune, and so in order for this to perpetuate, it's got to be able to bounce around and be able to infect children. And once you get a big population with a lot of cities and interconnectedness of moving from city to city, you can sustain an ongoing children's disease for centuries. Measles had been around for centuries when I was a kid, and potentially could get the measles. I was pre-vaccine. When the Europeans started to move elsewhere, they would carry these diseases with them. Not the childhood diseases so much as the diseases that were affecting the adults, that were already considered fairly nasty because they were still kind of cooking in the adult population, but things like smallpox, and certain types of meningitis. There's a whole bunch of different things that they carried out with them that the local populations they came in contact with had never been exposed to, what they call a naive host population. And so that decimation was going to happen, even though the sailors on the boats, a couple of them probably died on the trips, but it kind of kept the disease kind of cooking in that small population, so that there still were infectious individuals when they got where they were going, because it took a while, a few weeks to get there. But there really wasn't anything equivalent in the local indigenous populations for them to bring back, because the local indigenous populations didn't have these huge networks of interconnected cities. So the patterns wind up being different. The coronavirus, just I said I was going to talk about it. It doesn't follow the same pattern of virulence right at the beginning. Yes, there's a small subpopulation of the humans that are old or have some other kinds of issues that it can be very nasty in. But for the general population, for whatever reason, whether it's a genetic resistance or a circumstantial resistance of having already been exposed to a viral disease, it isn't really causing really major issues in the adult population that's going to interfere with its spread. Because you got to look at this from the disease organism standpoint. It needs to get its offspring out and about. It is infecting adults that are not really, really old. Is it, in some cases, is affecting them, not killing them, but giving them other kinds of issues, because unlike other coronaviruses, this thing seems to be able to spread through a bunch of systems. In the, I don't know, right or wrong hosts, it does act very differently in different hosts, and in some hosts it is leaving them debilitated in odd ways, heart problems, brain problems, liver problems. Is that the molecule that this virus uses as an entry point turns out to be on cells all over your body. And when the viruses, if the viruses can get free from your lungs, they seem to be able to move into cells all over the place. And in different people show different effects from being able to do that. But it's not really following this particular kind of pattern. Okay, we have one more section of this particular chapter that's going to be on the next video.